I think in game rating circles, my official title is The Other Richard. So today I'm Todd. Are we good on the mic there? Is this one's good and this one's off? All right. So thanks everybody for coming to Dynamic Stories for Dynamic Games. I always start off in saying a little bit of a spoiler warning. People always complain when I maybe talk about endings of games during talks. I don't do it too badly in this, but if you see a game you're really intent on not knowing anything about, I recommend you duck your head and cover your ears quickly. I don't spoil anything that's come out in the last couple of years. Also, I have a lot of references to some other articles in this. I will be putting the slides up on my website by this time tomorrow. Let's say that's my deadline. So you can go grab them off of here if you want to get some of those references and some other links that I had to cut out for time. So it's funny when I come to GDC, and I swear it's like this alternate reality where everyone is talking about narratives and branching and player choices and empowerment and innovative stuff and to do with stories and games. But I found the world outside of GDC is a little bit different. You go back to your development team and like, we should do this cool thing I saw. And they're like, why would we do that? Dynamic stories, that doesn't matter. It's crazy. Get back in your hole, writer. So why, so I get this question a lot. Why do you care about dynamic stories? Why do that? Why do you want to have multiple endings? Why do you want to change the story based on what the player does? And for me, literally, it's why I wanted to get into working on games and making games, because I love the idea of setting up situations where the player comes into a situation and has to make difficult choices and then sees the ramifications of those. So for me, it's so innate that I want to tell these stories. So it's tricky to explain it. And believe me, I've heard all the reasons not to do this from all the different disciplines. So you have reasons not to from programmers. Programmers always talk about how incredibly hard it can be to do interactive storytelling. And they're right. It can be incredibly hard if you take it to that sort of extreme. But programmers, you just need to tell them, look, you guys are really smart. You're able to simulate incredibly complex physics. You're able to render things that look like the real world. And you had to make concessions and trade-offs to do that. And we can do the same thing with any sort of dynamic storytelling. I also hear, from producers, and usually the answer there is, not surprisingly, it'll cost too much money. And that's what producers say about everything you ask them for, right? It's just like when the artists go and ask for their fancy shader set, or the combat designers want to do some crazy motion capture suit. They're shot down by the producers too, but they go back and they fight and they say, no, we need this to push the game forward, and this is what's going to make it great. And we need to get used to fighting, to have dynamic elements in our stories if we really want them, just like the other departments do. But I also hear reasons not to from writers sometimes. And probably some of the people in this room right now are saying, well, I came to this talk because I know I hate dynamic stories, and we'll see if you can change my mind. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for that, right? The history of storytelling outside of games is certainly very linear and is used to certain structures that have worked well and things we've learned over many years of telling stories, to which I say you're right. Those things are true. Those things do work, and they have worked in some games. But I think this is a new medium. We need to try new things. And I know it's a little scary, but I'm hoping it'll be better in the end. And finally, from designers, the answer I always get there is, but players only play the game once, so who cares? And I want to, as an answer to that, look at the types of games that are the most popular right now out in the world. If you set aside sort of multiplayer games as sort of a separate entity, we can look at a lot of the other successful games are ones with these big, gigantic open worlds of one kind, with tons of things you can do them, tons of dynamic things you can do with the gameplay, often still with sort of a linear story in the middle, but they end up having a lot of dynamic storytelling elements around that. And these games typically have, tons of content to support all of this. If we look on the other side of the spectrum, though, we'll see for smaller single-player games, players have been gravitating towards a different type of style, things that are procedurally generated, things like roguelikes or roguelike-likes or roguelites or whatever we're calling them this week. These present games that provide an infinite variety of challenge to players. And interestingly, most of them eschew traditional storytelling, opting just to set the tone and the setting and then go from there, with Sunless Sea maybe being a notable exception. So why do players like these games despite their lack of narrative? Well, players, we have to recognize, have a limited amount of money, right? They want to buy a game they can really get value out of, that they can play over and over again, that they can feel that is really challenged, and they feel that is reacting to what they're doing. Another reason that has recently arrived is the advent of streaming as a thing that is everywhere. And everyone watches games being streamed now. And if you want to make a narrative game, but it's the same every time you play it, it's not going to be that interesting to stream, frankly. And both of the consoles now have really easy clip sharing, where you can share gameplay clips with your friends. And there's nothing more depressing than sharing a clip with someone else, only to look at his clips and see his clips of the game is exactly the same as your clips of the game. And to realize, hey, wait a minute, maybe these games aren't as dynamic as I thought they were. So now we can't get away with that, and I think we need to work at making games that are dynamic, that people react to well in a variety of ways, including streaming and sharing. And I think as long as we're doing that, we should also focus on how can we make the stories in those things dynamic as well. So I still wonder why these games are focusing on having such static stories in the middle of it, but not all of it is. And I think there's a lot of techniques that games are doing already that we can use that can really open things up and tell dynamic stories. So I'm going to go through a number of techniques that games are already doing today and talk about how those have been done before and how you might apply them to your game. So the first thing I want to talk about is something I call the explorable story space. So I'm going to go through this technique fairly quickly because it's pretty basic and it's used in a lot of games successfully already. So if we look at something like Fallout or the Bethesda games in general, these are often these giant RPGs and these giant worlds that have that core narrative, but then they have a lot of side narrative around them, little stories that you can do or not do. And we can look at this in smaller games as well, like Gone Home, despite being a much smaller scale game, still had a lot of pieces on the side of it that you might find or not find, depending on how long you looked at the game and how thorough you were trying to be. And the important thing for this sort of side content is that it has to be completely optional. And that allows different players to find different pieces and to come up with their own version of the story based on the pieces they find. And the players who want to put more time into it will find more of it. And the other ones who just want to get through it quickly can do that. And then when they compare stories later, they will be talking about a different experience they both had. And this will increase their engagement in the work. Now, when I say explorable story space, I don't necessarily mean physically exploring the space. Obviously, Her Story is a recent example where you were literally sitting glued in a chair in front of a computer terminal the whole time in the fiction of the game. But you were exploring the story through all these clips you were finding on the computer. One more example I want to bring up of this before we move on is the excellent adventure game, The Last Express, from a number of years ago. Amazingly well-written and structured, where you're sort of moving through this very the last Orient Express, right before World War I, and seeing all these different stories in different parts of the train. And I don't think you can actually get the entire story through one playthrough because of all the layers of it that you can see depending where you are at what point in the game. So the next technique I want to talk about is something I call the open-ended story. And it's hard to call this a game technique because really this works in stories you might be writing, in any medium. So if we look at, say, novels, we can look at novels like Slaughterhouse-Five or The Martian Chronicles, tell stories that leave a lot out or that are fairly convoluted and involve you, trying to interpret what's going on in them, trying to figure out what's going on. Certainly there are a lot of movies like this as well. If we look at something like The Shining or Inception, a lot is left up to personal interpretation in these movies about what exactly is happening. These type of works that are still linear encourage repeated viewings just to try to figure out what's going on. And fans come up with their own theories and debate them with each other, and in so doing, make these stories interactive in a way. Indeed, Brian Upton, in his excellent book, The Aesthetic of Play, talks about this, where he says, as we leap from beat to beat, we choose a set of interpretive constraints to explain each beat's presence. These interpretive constraints generate expectations about the direction and significance of the story. Future beats either confirm or falsify these expectations, triggering either satisfaction or frustration. It's a really fascinating book to check out. And he talks about how just the act of reading and interpreting is interactive in its own way. So if we extend this to games and we look at something like, Dear Esther, which is on some level completely non-interactive in terms of the story, because it's really just the voiceover narration you're hearing juxtaposed with the imagery you're seeing. There's really nothing you can change about it, but it's so sort of minimalist in its structure that you really have to, you can't help but interpret what you're seeing and hearing as you're playing and coming up with your own theory to figure out what exactly is going on and being said here. Another example of a way to do that is to make your characters, really abstract and cartoony would be one word even, where, maybe they don't necessarily say words that you even understand, but that you get just a sense of them from these sort of broad strokes, and you end up having to bring a lot of yourself to the experience to fill in those details yourself and get invested in the work that way. Or, you can take another approach. In Silent Hill, they have a very specific, very detailed story, but they just show you only these tiny slices of it, and you're just left with these big holes that you have to fill in one way or the other. So a final thought about open-ended stories. A word of warning, I guess. I've seen a lot of games have really great open-ended stories that you're interpreting as you're going, and then at the end, they feel, at the end of the game, they feel the need to resolve it all and explain exactly what happened. And that can be very frustrating. I think some of the best open-ended stories in other mediums, like, say, the end of The Shining or the end of Inception, they kind of open it up again, right? They bring in some sort of resolution to help you understand what the heck just happened in the movie, but then they have something at the end that twists it a bit and is like, well, actually this, and then you're left sitting there going, oh, wait, maybe my theory is still valid. The worst thing you can do, I think, is get to the end of one of these very open-ended experiences and then shut it all down so the player feels like, all of their theories are thrown out the window. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about, I refer to as reacting to player actions. This is one of the most common things that people talk about when they talk about interactive storytelling and branching. So obviously, I'm going to go through this quickly as well. We're all familiar with BioShock that had the choice of the little sisters, whether you harvested or rescued them, basically the same choice that you're making over and over again throughout the game. And then Mass Effect handled this differently with their, blue for Paragon, red for Renegade type of choices. But the game is balanced in such a way that you're really encouraged to pick one and just keep making that choice for the entire game, sort of having that same shortcoming that BioShock had. Some interesting other examples of this where it worked a little better. If you look at the indie game The Novelist, you have much fewer choices than you have in BioShock or Mass Effect, but they're not coupled to each other, really. You're able to make one choice here and make one choice here, and it doesn't push you to any one of them as the right ending or the right choice to make. And it can have all these sort of interesting ramifications in the story, and there is no right answer. The Walking Dead game, certainly, that first season, had a lot of interesting choice points throughout it and never labeled which one was good or which one was bad or anything like that. It had so many of them throughout the game that they started feeling like a real system, and you never knew which one was going to be the important one that would be remembered. And they were really good at setting up complex situations that didn't have a clear right or wrong answer. Interestingly, Firewatch is an interesting evolution of this, right, where Firewatch builds on that same idea of tons of little dialogue choices affecting things. And it's interesting to see online a few complaints that, oh, well, all the choices you make don't actually affect the plot of that game very much. But to me, the heart and soul of that game is really the relationship you have with Delilah, the other radio tower operator. And that does change substantially based on how you talk to her. And that's sort of what's most important about the game. So it is very impactful what happens, even if the plot is relatively similar. Of course, there are other games that approach branching not through these just narrative choices, but actually through the choices you make in gameplay. Like, this is the classic way to do it in an immersive sim, like a Dishonored sort of situation, where the way you go about playing the levels affect not only gameplay ramifications, like those rats that swarm you, but also narrative changes. And this is sort of aggregating all the choices you're making throughout the game. Not dissimilar to Papers, Please, which does the same thing, where all the choices you're making are during gameplay and add up to the different endings you can get. And there's been a lot of exploration of branching. It's very interesting in the interactive fiction space. If you want to check that out, I recommend Googling patterns in choice games. There's a great sort of blog post by this Sam Cabo-Ashwell, I hope I pronounced that right, where he talks about all the different structures that have been done in different games. And it was a really fascinating, quick read on the subject. So next we have shifting story elements. And this is something that's really not done as much in games and is really fascinating to me as a result. So this is, we can think of this, if you think of this in terms of, say, adapting a murder mystery. Like, one can think of the act of reading a mystery novel, like one of these books. It's really a puzzle of a sort, right? You're trying to figure out who did the murder before you get to the end. You're trying to find a resolution to that puzzle yourself before the private investigator or whatever gets to it by the end. The second time you read a book like this, it's much less interesting because you already know who was responsible for doing the killing. Even for books like this that are expertly well written, it's definitely a different experience when you read it the second time. So when they adapted this into board game form originally, they made the board game Clue, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And here they randomize who was responsible for the murder and who did the murdering. And voila, you now have a replayable murder mystery. Interestingly, when they turned this into a movie, they said, hey, well, so we've got this Clue board game. It's got random people who are guilty. What if we did something similar with this movie, where we had different endings that would give you different people who were guilty of the crime? Of course, this kind of doesn't really work very well because they had to make the endings work with any of the possible, they had only one version of the main film and then these different endings sort of tacked on. The main version of the movie had to support any ending that happened to come up. So now you had no way to actually figure out who did the murder because all of these different endings were possible. So of course, when you adapt this into game form, you can do better than that. So the example I like, and there were a number of these in the 80s that did this actually, that had these murder mystery games where you were trying to solve a mystery, but who actually had done the killing and who was killed was randomized each time you play. And because it was a game, they were able to plant little clues all along the way that you were playing, and you would be able to solve it, unlike the Clue movie. Another example I like to bring up all the time is the Blade Runner game, where each character in the game could be a replicant or not, depending on basically a die roll at the beginning of the game. And then this would affect what you had to do with them, because you were hunting for these people and had to make choices about what happened to them. So some of the really interesting work in this sort of randomized story space is actually done in board games, going back to the classic Arabian Nights game, or more modern games that sort of randomize the narrative in different ways. Obviously, these have the benefit of having multiple players in them, but they still do good things to change up the story every time, so it feels like a very dynamic experience and different every time you play. An interesting example you might want to check out is this game, The Black Closet, which is actually nominated for an IGF award this year, and I believe you can go play it on the show floor. This is sort of an interesting mixed match of several different game types, sort of like a dating sim mixed with sort of an adventure game. And here you're in this all-female boarding school, and there are these things like who's going to betray you, and each game is randomized each time you play. Along with the other stuff. And by sort of combining it with a sim and these random narrative elements, you're really getting to a very different experience each time you play. So my own game, The Church in the Darkness, which is now in development, is set inside a religious cult in the 1970s, but the player doesn't know whether that cult group is merely happy socialists who want to go live in the jungle, or if something more dark and apocalyptic is going to happen there. And the key to this is the leader's personality is randomized each time you play the game, so you don't know what exactly you're dealing with, and you're sort of acting as a detective going into their sort of jungle compound to figure out what's going on. So beyond just the interesting factor from a replay factor, I thought it was also interesting because I felt it fit thematically with the hard-to-understand nature of cults, where they can be really hard to tell if it's actually a good group or something more sinister from the outside. So it's my hope that by including this shifting story element, you're able to see both sides of what can be a very complex story. And I like specifically games that combine this sort of shifting story elements with player choices. Like the unfortunate thing about player choices, when you make them in a game, if you ever want to go back and replay the game, naturally you're probably going to want to make the same choices. And often when you go back, if you want to see all the content, you'll force yourself to just make the choices you don't want to make, which is not really a great experience. However, if the context of the game is shifting, so that it's different this time, you'll want to make different choices the second time you're playing because the context is different, because the reasons you're making these choices are different. And that makes games like these hopefully replayable in a more interesting way. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about a bit is character simulation. So this is one of the harder methods to implement, but also represents sort of one of the less charted areas, so I think a great area for future experimentation. With character simulation techniques, each character in your story has a simulated personality with their own wants and needs, desires, friendship, allegiances, and these dynamically change based on your behavior as you're moving through the story, sort of based on what you do. This sounds super complicated, and it can be, but its simpler forms are possible that still produce some interesting results. So probably the most commercially successful example of this is The Sims, right? In The Sims, you're able to manipulate the personalities of these people and play them off each other in these interesting ways. The possibility space of The Sims is intentionally, I think, quite broad. It lets anyone live out whatever version of American suburban life they want, whether that's getting married in whatever fashion they find suitable, or having a goth family, or even torturing their Sims. This all feels like it fits because the game is so cartoony, because it's so broad. Any goofy thing that happens feels like it fits okay into the game. Another game that people don't often think of as a storytelling experience, but I think is doing this, is Civilization, and the different sort of leaders of the different countries that you meet as you're playing. And they'll come to you, trying to negotiate peace or talking about threatening war or setting up a trade deal or whatever it is, and they'll remember your past interactions with them, and they'll remember whether you, betrayed them before, or who else you're having a fight with, and then try and negotiate. And this was taken even farther in the sort of cousin of Civilization, Alpha Centauri, which treated the heads of state even more like believable characters, and they each had their own sort of political agenda and their own philosophical beliefs that affected whether they were going to want to side with you, and they sort of gave you feedback based on how you were playing the game, whether they agreed with it or not. Few consider these types of games really story games, yet there's no reason this sort of faction-based reaction system of these games couldn't work to emphasize it even more and make it feel even more like a narrative. There's a couple of games that used character simulation that were definitely going for something more narrative, and the first of those is Versu. This was an interactive fiction system that used a much stronger story framework and much more limited player choices than you would find in The Sims or something like that. So this was a much more confined social situation. The player was able to engage with all the characters in a number of different ways, and these choices would persist and then affect their relationships with each other. And the first setting for the Versu stories was this sort of Jane Austen-ish social settings where character dynamics are everything. Prom Week is another interesting example of this sort of social simulation in a very carefully chosen setting, the week before high school prom, a time rich with narrative possibilities and potential conflicts. It takes a Sims-like approach to controlling these characters, where your only goal is you're not just playing Dollhouse like you're playing in The Sims, you're actually trying to get people to pair up with each other and following some pretty, more confined goals. The game uses a pretty elaborate personality model that replicates the social graft you might find in that hellish time of high school. But to work, both, it's interesting to look that Versu and Prom Week, both had really elaborate AI systems. So in addition to requiring, a kick-ass AI team to implement something like this, they also made very specific, careful choices about the setting they were in that would have a tone that would allow this kind of gameplay to work. So you want something that allows for these interesting narrative simulations in the case of sort of the Jane Austen-ish story or a prom type of situation. And they both sort of chose a tone that was very deliberately silly, even slapstick, farcy, where the player might try to do all these goofy things, but they would still feel like they would fit in with the game. There's many potential settings, I think, where if you tried to do character simulation would be much harder to do, particularly when I think the technique is in its infancy, as it is now. And the other thing these games were really good at was telegraphing what was going on to the player. And I think that's super important when you're trying to do something as complex than this. Versu used, or rather Prom Week used a menu system that was very much like The Sims that really gave you all sorts of bars and graphs and things about how everybody felt with everyone else. And even with all of that, it still was very hard to try to understand what was going on in the game if you didn't understand the simulation decently. Versu tried a more integrated approach where they had those little images at the bottom of the page, and they would actually change facial expression based on what their social state was at the time. And if you wanted more information, you could tap on them and a little box would pop up that would explain to you why they felt the way they did. And I know that over-telegraphing something like this can feel sort of aesthetically jarring, particularly as a writer. I feel that way myself. But I think a technique like this is in such its infancy that we really have to overdo it to give players a chance to catch up. It's like people didn't learn how to watch movies. They learned over the years, and films get more and more subtle in their techniques. And I think we have to see games the same way when trying something this ambitious and different. And indeed, Emily Short, the co-creator of Versu, had this great quote. She said, "My general rule of thumb is it's pointless to simulate anything in AI that you don't also have a plan for communicating to the player. Otherwise, they don't see how clever you're being, or worse, what is actually sophisticated behavior winds up looking like a bug." And if you want to hear more about Versu or Prom Week, there's this excellent talk on the GDC Vault that's up there for free. You can just search for Beyond Eliza, and it pops up, and they talk about both of those projects and how they worked in there. Now, the final example I want to talk about is drama management. I like to think of drama management as the flip side of character simulation, whereas character simulation, the characters can sort of drift in sort of interesting ways, but that maybe don't end up feeling as much like stories. Here, this is actually steering things back towards something that feels like a story. You can think of this as akin to a D&D session where you have a really good DM who's trying to shape things into a certain narrative form. He allows a lot of agency for the players. but he is constantly steering things back to the story he wants to tell while still letting the players feel empowered. So the most interesting example of this in digital form, or the most well-known example, is Facade. In this game, the player enters into the apartment of a couple that is having an argument as part of a dinner party, and you're sort of there while their marriage is falling apart. The player here has a tremendous amount of agency. You can say whatever you want to the characters, and they'll try to react to it. And the game really does a pretty good job of steering it back to the main story it wants to tell. So Facade was always, was sort of interesting as an academic project, as a PhD project like it was when it was released, but then it found this interesting second life on the internet because it became very popular as a Let's Play thing. And people loved streaming this game because it was so reactive to whatever they would try, and they would make all these Let's Play videos of like, oh, let me try to get it to do this. And this is sort of going back to what I was saying before about streaming being a thing that's popular, where people who are streamers really want to find games that will do crazy, interesting things each time you play them. The other example I wanted to bring up of something that I consider to be drama management is the Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor. This is obviously a much more commercial application of it, but it takes all the interesting sort of simulation elements of an open world game with combat in it and shapes them into these little player stories that give you a lot of motivation to keep playing the game. And indeed, Michael Platter, who's sitting right over there, has said that the Nemesis system is emergent procedural narrative that's neither linear nor branching, which is an interesting way to think of what drama management is really trying to do. So just to give a quick summary of how this works, the game turns the common experience of dying in the game, turns it into a little piece of fiction, basically, where the player dies, but the world keeps going without him, and the player reincarnates. And the enemy who killed him is sort of shown how he's moving up in the ranks because he did this great thing of killing the player, and indeed he might get a promotion or something like that. And he is marked as a nemesis for you to go kill later in the game. And it's very good at creating these little vignettes when you come and find these characters. They'll show you a little cutscene of this guy, and they have all these lines of dialogue that they'll say to sort of taunt you at this time. They all have custom names and all of these little elements that went into the system that made it work well. And it's interesting that it's just taking completely the thing that you do in every open world game and just giving it all this context that makes it extra meaningful, sort of creating drama out of the simulation so that when you finally find this guy and kill him, it's a very satisfying moment. All right, so those are the 6 techniques I wanted to go through today. I think it can be interesting to look at your own projects and try to see which of these 6 things you're doing already. I'm not saying that every game should try to do all of these things, though that might be interesting if someone were to pull that off. But if maybe you're doing 1 or 2 of them, maybe you can add a third of some kind. It really depends on the needs of your game. But I think if you find that you're doing 0 of these things, I would argue maybe you're not making a great game story. And I think, at the beginning of the talk, I talked about how it was important to look at this because of streaming and sharing and all of that stuff. And I think the reality is that streaming has revealed a dirty little secret that we've had in making single-player games for a while, and that's that we made the experiences feel dynamic to the player, but they weren't actually, right? That everybody felt they were having a unique experience, but really it was just exactly what we wanted to happen. And I think we can't hide behind that anymore. And I think even if a player never actually streams a game or never actually shares it or sees it in any other form, it's still important just for player investment. It's still important for players to feel like they're involved in the story, if it's dynamic in some way, and that they can affect it. I think you have to recognize that there have been many games that are very successful using this technique, whether it's finding that last safe that has the final clue to the side story in the part of the game you really want to figure out and feeling that you found that, or the abstract experience that really lets you invest yourself in it and feel that this becomes your story through that, or even just hunting down that guy and finally killing him after he's been your nemesis for a while, or that scene at the end where you remember all that time we had together and all the choices we made along the way. I think in short, I think when dynamic storytelling really works, players really love it, really become invested in it, and feel that they've told their own story. So, thanks.